We do worship a great God, don't we? We come together here to praise Him, to worship Him, to learn about Him through His Word. And we've been using the story of Ruth to turn our attention to this great God. The story opened on a poor, destitute widow named Naomi. She was heading back to her hometown after spending about 10 years living in a foreign, wicked land with her husband and 2 sons. God's judgment weighed heavily upon her, and in fact, evidence of it was clear. Her only source of livelihood, that husband and 2 sons, had been taken away. And so she returned to her hometown with nothing. No money, no hope of a future, or any ability to make a living and carry on her family name. Except Naomi did have one thing. A daughter-in-law named Ruth, born of that foreign nation, but proving in every way her love for Naomi and her commitment to Naomi's people and Naomi's God, the God of Israel. Ruth pledged to join Naomi in her destitute state and to care for her to the end. What would happen to these 2 beggar widows as they returned to Naomi's hometown of Bethlehem? Chapter 2. As it so happened, Naomi had one other thing. A God who is faithful and diligent to work out His plan of redemption, particularly in the lives of the destitute and the forgotten. God arranged to have Naomi's daughter-in-law Ruth meet another God-fearer by the name of Boaz, a man of upright standing in the community and plenty of wealth. Boaz proved to be a generous provider for the physical needs of these widows throughout the barley harvest. But what's more, he also proved to be a close relative with the ability to redeem them not just from their poverty, but their shame of having no children, no way of carrying on the family name. But would he be willing? Redemption and marriage for Ruth was no small favor to ask of this generous man. Chapter 3. Ruth followed her mother-in-law's instructions and approached Boaz in secret, doing the unthinkable, proposing marriage to him under the cover of darkness, requesting that he redeem her land and family. And God's redemptive plan was revealed a little bit more as Boaz proved himself to be not only able, but totally willing, in fact, eagerly diligent to act as an advocate and redeemer that God had given him the position, the opportunity to be. But there's a problem. Another man was a closer relative than he. And so that man had the first right to buy back Naomi's land and to marry Ruth. Who was this other relative? Would he show the same godliness, the same faithful kindness that Boaz had shown already in the story? We left the story of Ruth chapter 3 with these questions hovering overhead and one simple command from Naomi. Sit tight, Ruth. Wait to see what Boaz will do. He will not rest until the matter is settled today. And so now we turn to chapter 4. I would encourage you to do so if you have a Bible there with you. Turn to Ruth chapter 4. And as we do so, we will see not only the climax of this redemptive story, but if we allow him, I think God will turn our eyes to the big redemptive story that we are all a part of. And we will find renewed excitement over the work of our ultimate Redeemer. Therefore, we'll find the motivation to look to him in faith for renewal and sustenance and the hope that he provides. Let's turn to Ruth chapter 4. We're going to start out by looking at the first 12 verses as we talk about the story of Ruth moving from bitterness to blessing. We're going to first look at the first 12 verses and the accomplishment of redemption. Well, how does it actually happen? Well, it says there in verse 1, Boaz had gone up to the gate first thing in the morning, and he sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer whom he had spoken about came by, and Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And then Boaz took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. And he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi has come back from the country of Moab and is selling a parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you about it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here, in the presence of the elders of my people. If you'll redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, so that I may know, for there's no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." The first thing that we see in this accomplishment of redemption for Ruth and Naomi is something that we talked about last time we were talking about this in chapter 3. Boaz's diligence to go and to take the initiative in seeking their redemption. And he does it in a way that fulfills the legal requirements. This is a courtroom scene happening here. In those days, the sort of town square area where they would conduct business was the gate of the town. That was where you would have a space set aside to conduct courtroom kind of things, buying and selling of land, or marriage or whatever, these different things. You would gather elders together, and then they would be your witnesses, and you would conduct your business in that way. And so Boaz is doing exactly that. You see, Boaz is willing to redeem, but he's also a righteous man. He is a godly man who doesn't just go surreptitiously behind people's back and break the law. He does things legally. He gathers the elders together, and he says, "Sit down here," and then he presents the case to the other redeemer. And he says, "I will redeem it." The other redeemer says, the other relative says, "Sure, I'll do that." Then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." If you remember last time, we were talking about the role of the kinsman redeemer. And we talked about how the kinsman redeemer had a role of purchasing back land, which is what we see here, purchasing back land that someone had sold because of their poverty. They would have to sell their piece of the land, but the land was so important because it was their stake in the promise of God. Your land, where you live, is your piece of that promise of God. And so God said, that land is not going to stay sold forever. I'm going to provide the closest relative to be that kinsman redeemer who can buy back that land, so the land stays in the family, so that that family has a piece in the promise of God for all time. And so that's what Boaz is encouraging this other relative to do here, to fulfill that role. But it wasn't just about buying back land, it was about buying back the relative who had to sell themselves into slavery to pay off debts. And then it also came to include this idea of marrying the widow that didn't have any children to carry on that family name. Right? And so this is what's happening here in this courtroom setting. Boaz talks about buying back this land. The relative says, "Sure, I'll do that." And then Boaz says, "But one more thing. Don't forget, there's a widow involved here. And there's no children to carry on that family line. And so you will need to do that as well." The relative takes a step back. "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance." It's a costly thing to do this, to raise up a child to carry on another one's family line. And this relative says, "You know what? Buying the land and getting to have some extra land to farm and all that, sure, I'll do that. But carrying on the family name for this man Elimelech, not so sure about that. It's going to endanger my own inheritance." And so, it says this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging, To confirm a transaction, one drew off his sandal, gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. Again, this is a courtroom, remember? And so the writer, the narrator, is filling us in on the legal steps that had to be taken. And so he says, redeem it for yourself, buy it for yourself. And he drew off his sandal. And then Boaz turns to the witnesses. He says to the elders and all the people, you're witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, all that belonged to his sons, Chilion and Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day. You hear the heart of the Redeemer here. This is not about him. This is about fulfilling that role of maintaining that place in the land for his brother, Elimelech. We're not told if he was literal brothers or not, but in that sense of being close family members, Boaz shows himself to be the Redeemer who has a heart for those whom he is redeeming. It's not about him. It's about continuing that family line. It's about buying back what was lost. And what's the result of this for Boaz? Look at the end of this section, verses 11 to 12. It says, then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this woman. The Redeemer takes this step, fulfilling all legal requirements at great cost to himself, to buy back, to redeem the ones who were in need. And the result is a blessing pronounced by the witnesses on him. They say, may you be blessed. May your family line be blessed. May your family line be like Rachel and Leah. These are the two matrons of their family line, right? The ones that gave birth to the 12 men that would become the 12 tribes of Israel. And they're saying, may your family be as prosperous and as numerous as theirs because of what you have done. May your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Now, why would they mention that? Why would they mention Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah? Well, if you go to Genesis chapter 38, we're not going to have time to look through the whole thing, but I would encourage you to make a note of it and go back and read through that story another time. Genesis 38 tells a story of what should have been this kind of redemption. What should have been the closest relative marrying a widow without children and carrying on the family line for the name of his brother, for the sake of his brother. But instead, what happens is Judah, the father, it's one of his sons that the Lord puts to death because he was wicked. And Judah's son had a wife, Tamar. And so she goes to Judah, the father, and says, give me another one of the sons to carry on the family line. And so he does, but that other son also sins against the Lord, and the Lord puts him to death. And then finally, it gets down to Judah's last son, who's still too young to be married, and so he says, hold on, wait a while until he gets old enough, and then you can marry him and continue the family line. But as time goes on, the boy becomes of age, and Judah's not making any kind of move to give him to Tamar to carry on that family line. And so Tamar resorts to desperate measures, tricking Judah into thinking that she's a prostitute, and he sleeps with her, and she gets pregnant and has a son, Perez. That's That's messed up, isn't it? Does God work in messed up situations? Does God work through sinful, broken people? Yeah, he does. And these elders, now as Boaz, actually does what Judah refused to do. His forefather Judah refused to do the right thing, and now Boaz here, doing the right thing, the elders recognize that connection, and they say, may your house be as numerous and as prosperous as Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Does this picture of Boaz, the Redeemer, help to enliven your perspective on Jesus, our ultimate Redeemer? Do you see the way that Jesus fulfilled the legal requirements in God's courtroom and willingly sacrificed his own life to purchase us back from our slavery to sin, death? Do you see with fresh eyes the blessing pronounced by the people on this Redeemer? Worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive power and wealth and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and praise. The Redeemer is lifted up, and a blessing is pronounced upon him for his work. Seeing the way that Boaz accomplished the redemption of Ruth and Naomi and their property certainly ought to color our perspective of our own redemption. But there's more to be found here in the epilogue of the story, which speaks to the way we too can live in the light of that redemption. And that is, by looking at verses 13 to 17, we see the result. What resulted from this redeeming act of Boaz? Look at verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception. She bore a son. And then the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer. May his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him, given birth to him. So Naomi took the child, laid him on her lap, and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. The result of Boaz's action of redemption resulted in a blessing from those witnesses on him. But he's not the only one who receives a pronouncement of blessing, is he? Verse 14, it says, the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer. And then they turn their attention to the child and they say, may he be renowned in Israel. He will be like a restorer of life to you, Naomi. See, Naomi receives a blessing too. God's name is praised and lifted up. Naomi receives the blessing of life. This child brings life. The hope of life where there was only death before. The continuation of the family line where there was no hope. Bringing restoration where there was loss. Flip back a page or two to the end of Ruth chapter 1. It's no accident that the end of the first chapter looks kind of like a mirror image of the end of the last chapter. How does chapter 1 end? It's a conversation between Naomi and the women of the village. Just like at the end of chapter 4. It's a very different conversation, isn't it? It says in chapter 1, verse 19, so the two of them, Ruth and Naomi, went on till they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town stirred because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? She said to them, don't call me Naomi. Call me bitter. That's what Mara means. Call me bitter, because the Lord, the Almighty, has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full. The Lord brought me back empty. Why would you call me Naomi when the Lord testified against me that the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? The story begins with Naomi sitting empty-handed in Bethlehem, telling the other women, call me bitterness, Mrs. Bitter. The story ends with what? A baby in Naomi's lap. The Lord has filled where he had taken away. He provided hope and a future. He filled what was empty. This is, I think, a big part of the reason why all the attention is put on Naomi here at the end. This is the book of Ruth, but in many ways it's the story of Naomi. It's a story of God redeeming her and her family line. And he uses righteous Ruth and righteous Boaz to do it. This is why in verse 17 it says, the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. Not a son has been born to Boaz and Ruth, right? It's like, this is Naomi's child. This is God fulfilling his redemptive purposes for her life. And the name Obed that they gave him means servant. Servant. This child would be a servant of Naomi, perhaps, in her old age. This child would be a servant of God's purposes for redemption. What result has redemption wrought in your life? Is the one born from Boaz's line truly your source of life and restoration? Are you embracing the servant of God who redeems your life and brings true restoration and nourishment for the journey of faith? What did the women say of this child who was born? He will be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. We talked about how redemption is seen to bring blessing to Boaz and Ruth, and especially Naomi here at the close of the story. But we must not ignore those last 4 verses, verses 18 to 22. They're not just tacked on as some kind of fun fact by a random historian. They are crucial to the purpose of the whole story. This is a story about family line. And so the presence of this genealogy provides an important exclamation point for this message of redemption. We don't think much of genealogies in our culture. You know who your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was? Perhaps you do if you've done some of those background studies. It meant everything to them. And that's what these last 4 verses show. They show the significance of what has happened here, the significance of the redemption. It says these are the generations of Perez. Remember, going back to, not to Judah or to Abraham, it goes back to Perez, the original child, surrogate child of redemption. Perez fathered Hezron, Hezron fathered Ram, Ram fathered Amminadab, Amminadab fathered Nahshon, Nahshon fathered Salmon, Salmon fathered Boaz, Boaz fathered, and now the line continues on to the future. Boaz fathered Obed, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered who? David. Who's David? David, the king, to whom God made the promise that his line would be an everlasting line, that there would be a king like David who would rule for eternity, fulfilling the promise that God had made all the way back at the very beginning of the whole biblical story, that a seed of the woman that a child born of a woman would crush the head of the serpent, the devil, and would be wounded in the process. This is part of David's story. This is part of Jesus' story. It's part of our story. This shows God's faithfulness to his promises and to his plan. This shows God's willingness to use lowly, the unimportant, quote unquote, the unimportant people in his plan. Think of Tamar, the woman who resorted to desperate means to carry on the family line. Now Ruth, the Moabitess from this forsaken country of Moab that Israel had such terrible relations with. God uses people like us in the accomplishment of his redemptive plan. How does this truth come home to our hearts today? Do you see the lengths our God has gone to in order to provide that ultimate redeeming, ruling king in his son Jesus? Does this simple genealogy serve as a corrective lens to allow you to see the faithfulness and love of God a little clearer? Does it stir your heart to greater trust and greater willingness to live a life of loving faithfulness for this one who has loved you so faithfully? The story of Ruth and Naomi ought to stir up in us a fresh appreciation for the redemption that has been faithfully orchestrated by God the Father, faithfully accomplished on our behalf by Jesus Christ, the Son, and applied to us by his Holy Spirit. And this story should also give us a fresh taste of the sweetness of the life we are offered by faith in Jesus, as we are rescued from the emptiness, the bitterness of our old ways of life. In the end, this story should drive us to do one thing each day in the week ahead, in the year ahead, in our lifetime ahead. And that's to look for renewal and sustaining grace in the Redeemer God has provided. Until we can come to grips at a heart level with the blessing we have received in our Redeemer, we will always turn elsewhere for our source of renewal, for our source of sustenance. The problem is, we will never find renewal or sustenance in anything else other than the Redeemer born to us from the line of Boaz, Obed, Jesse, David. The path from bitterness to blessing is one of trusting in God's gracious work, often through unexpected, even unwanted means. It's a path that leads us to the Redeemer, who we are invited to embrace, and from whom we find real renewal, real sustenance in our old age, in our young age, in our middle age, whatever age we are. When was the last time you experienced renewal from the lifelessness of past habits? When was the last time you felt sustained in your walk through the rocky terrain of your life? Imagine what it would feel like to experience the fullness where there was once emptiness. To experience strength for the next step of your journey when you weren't sure you could move another inch. Those are the things our Redeemer offers. Will you turn to him? Let's pray. Father, we thank you for the work that you have done. Thank you for the beautiful picture of redemption that we find here in the book of Ruth. Thank you for that genealogy and the evidence of your faithfulness to your promises down through the ages. Help us, Lord, to trust you, that we would live out of the assurance that you are at work in our messed up situations, that you are bringing about redemption. Help us to cling to you in faith, to cling to the Redeemer you have provided for us in Jesus Christ. And it's in his name that I pray these things. Amen.